All right, hello to the unit and welcome, I should say, to the Unit 4 review session. I'm going to try to walk you through some of the specific things that will be tested. During class, I kind of teach a full holistic approach, give you all the context behind it to try and help it make sense. But here, that's not what I'm doing. I'm just going to go through and hit the main points that you're definitely going to be tested on for this and for the AP exam. So let's dive right in. First thing, I've created a test overview. Basically went through the entire test and listed out how many questions on each topic there would be. I want you to notice a couple of quick things. First, that it's pretty widespread. There's no more than 3 questions on any one topic in our multiple choice section, right? Second thing I'd like you to notice is that we are dealing with a few equations that you really need to know well. The first one is you should know unemployment rate and how to calculate that. And you should also know how to calculate CPI and calculate inflation, right? So those are going to be really important to you. And that CPI calculation, or sorry, that inflation calculation, the current minus previous divided by previous, will also be used when you're measuring economic growth. Obviously, know your GDP metrics there, SIG-JIXIN and RIP, and you should be in pretty good shape. The only other thing I'll point out is the types of unemployment. Make sure you know what cyclical, frictional, and structural unemployment are. And then because you have 3 multiple choice questions on it, and then you also have points on the FRQ where you label them based on scenarios. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful to you. You can do a screenshot of that. I'll also post these slides on Canvas so you can have access to them at your leisure. All right, let's move on. So we're jumping right in with nominal and real GDP. So first, what is GDP? GDP is the total goods produced within the borders of a nation in a given year. And what it basically tells us is the economic health of our society, because when we produce goods, we pay people money. When we pay people money, they take that money and they spend it. When they spend that money, businesses have profit. When businesses are profitable, they produce more goods. So indication that everything is working how it should be is a continual increase in GDP, just like that. All right, so nominal versus real. So nominal GDP is just not corrected for inflation. So we're taking it, basically counting goods and services in this year's prices. But real GDP, we actually account for inflation. We correct for it. So we have 2 ways that we do that. The first way is by using this price times quantity metric, where we multiply current goods by base year prices. And I'll show you how to do that in a second. The second approach is using our deflator equation, which is going to be an important one for you. Got a couple questions on it. The deflator equation is just your nominal GDP divided by your deflator, or we call it our CPI, same thing, in hundreds. So if it's the CPI is 110, you divide by 1.1, for example. And then that kicks out your real GDP number, or in other words, deflates it. It takes away the impact of prices. The main reason we try to correct for it is when we have an increase in nominal GDP, we don't know if that's caused by an increase in our production, which is good, or an increase in inflation, which is bad. So real GDP helps us decipher between those two. Okay, so let's jump over here and answer these 2 questions, and we'll come back to what is not counted. All right, so got a couple examples here. So this is the way we're going to do it today. My first one, question number 1, it says, in a nation that produces only watches, the following occurs. In year 1, they sell 50 watches at a price of $2 each. And in year 2, they sell, that shouldn't say peaches, that should say watches. They sell 70 watches at $7 each. All right, show the change in nominal GDP and real GDP. So this is using my price times quantity metric. So I'm going to put nominal GDP in year 1, so nominal year 1, because I know I need to find that. I'm going to put nominal year 2, showing the change. Then over here, on the other side of the squiggle, I'm going to have real in year 1, and I'm going to have real in year 2. All right, so nominal, I simply multiply price times quantity in each year. Price times current, or current quantity times current price. So in year 1, I sold 50 watches at $2 a piece. My nominal GDP is going to be 100. In year 2, simply price times quantity. I had 70 watches. I sold them at $7 each. That's going to be 490. Is that right? Let me check my math here. Sad that I have to check this. It's been a long time since I played around the world mathematics. So did I get it right? Yeah, I got it right. You guys knew that already too, didn't you? All right, anyways, so nominal GDP went up by 390. That's a whole lot. But what happened to real GDP? Well, real GDP, I take my current quantity, but I multiply it by base year prices, right? In other words, I'm correcting for inflation by simply not counting my current prices at all. So we're assuming year one is our base year because we're only given 2 years. So first we have $2. 50 watches being sold at $2 each. So my real GDP is 100. And so notice my real GDP and my nominal GDP are the same in my base year. Always, 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 because there's no inflation to make that difference. In year two, I sold 70, but I'm not going to multiply them by $7. I'm going to multiply them by 2. So 70 watches multiplied by base year prices. So 70 times 2 or 140. So we can see that my GDP, my real GDP went up, but just a little bit. My nominal GDP went up a whole lot. And we can say when nominal GDP is outpacing or growing at a higher rate than real GDP, we know we have inflation going on. Our economy is being inflated. The difference between these two numbers is caused by inflation. The reason 490 is so much greater than 140 is inflation. Our GDP only rose by 40, but our nominal GDP rose by 490, caused by inflation. Hope that makes some sense. Let's jump over here to the second one and we'll use our other equation. We have nominal GDP, we're told it's $3.5 billion. We're given a CPI, we're told it's 120. What's the real GDP? I'm given all the information I need for a deflator equation. I know my deflator equation because I teach this class. My deflator equation is nominal. Nominal is always on top. And I divide it by my CPI. My CPI is 120. But I'm going to divide not by CPI in hundred or in that format, but in hundreds. So instead of 120, I'm going to divide it by 1.2. Okay, so nominal divided by my CPI in hundreds, or my deflator in hundreds, we often call it. So if my nominal GDP is 3.5 and my CPI is 1.2, that's going to kick out my real GDP. Pull out my handy dandy calculator here. 3.5 divided by 1.2 equals 2.91. 2.91, I should put a dollar sign here and a B, billion dollars, right? So you should notice that my nominal GDP is greater than my real GDP. I've deflated that number. That's why we call it the deflator equation. I've deflated that number to account for inflation. So now I have a better picture of what's actually going on in my economy. Okay, so that's two examples of some questions you might be asked. What is not counted as a part of GDP is important as well. A couple of questions on this. So what is not counted? First, remember we're looking at all final goods produced within the borders of the U.S. So if anything doesn't fall under that criteria, it doesn't count as our GDP. So if something is produced overseas, but we consume it here, that's not counted as a part of GDP. It's counted as part of their GDP. So first thing is intermediate goods. These are resources or input units, right? So if I'm making cheeseburgers to sell, I'm selling cheeseburgers. When I buy the buns, I don't count that towards GDP. When I buy the patties, that doesn't count towards GDP. I buy the pickles, doesn't count. Onions doesn't count. Cheese doesn't count, right? None of the condiments, none of them count. Because eventually I'm going to put all those things together in one giant delicious hamburger, cheeseburger, I should say. I'm going to sell that. And when I sell that unit, the value of all of those inputs is included in that one hamburger. So I'm only going to count it once I sell that unit altogether to a final consumer. And the reason we don't count those intermediate goods when I'm building the thing I'm about to sell is because if I count it there and then I count it when I sell the burger as well, I'm double counting. I'm counting cheese twice, once as its own product and once as a part of another product. So I can't do that. Okay, the other one is used goods. Anything that's used, vintage is one that they always throw in there to try and throw you off a little bit. It's not counted because we counted it once upon a time. All right, let's keep rolling into the next section. Maybe. Oh, I gotta close this. Here we go. Okay, next up is GDP per capita. So GDP alone doesn't really tell us what the quality of life is, but GDP per capita gets us a little bit closer. It basically gives us an average salary of every person in that population. So we take our real GDP and we divide it by our population. Very, very simple equation. Real GDP divided by population kicks out a GDP per capita. And you should know that this has to do with the quality of life. If GDP per capita is going up, the quality of life is generally getting better. We know that's not a perfect metric, but it's one of the best things we have right now. Okay, so let's pop over here, check out this one, and then we'll come back over to the left and it'll help us answer our question. So here's our example. It says, in year one, real GDP is 500 million, and the population is 14 million for nation B. So we have our real GDP and we have our population. And then in year two, real GDP is 700 million and the population is 15 million. Give the GDP per capita in year one and year two. I can do that. So I pop over here to my little marker. Okay, so I'm looking at GDP per capita. So GDP/C for year one and GDP per capita, sorry for the bad writing, for year two. All right, I simply take my real GDP divided by my population. So first, I take 500 and I divide it by 14. So I jump over here on my calculator. 500 divided by 14 kicks out $35.7 per person. Not very good, right? Let's look at GDP per capita in year two. In year two, I'll change my color here. Show a differentiator here. In year two, I have GDP of 700 million, a population of 15 million. Notice both GDP and population are growing. So I simply take my 700, right, my real GDP, and I divide it by my population. 700 divided by 15. And I see that my GDP per capita has gone up to 46.6. Now, also not good, but if we check over here, the next part of the question is this nation experiencing modern economic growth? So what is modern economic growth? Modern economic growth means that the quality of life is getting better. For a very long period of time in our world, the GDP per capita was stagnant because any increases in our GDP or our output was caused by an increase in our population. They're going up at the same rate, which means my GDP per capita is never changing. But when modern economic growth kicks in, normally with industrialization, new technology, new productivity is huge, right? When each individual can be more productive than they were before, then my GDP will rise at a greater rate than my population, making the GDP per capita larger and larger and larger. That's called modern economic growth. So as long as my GDP per capita is going up, I have modern economic growth. So the question is, if in year one, my GDP per capita was $35.70, in year two, it was $46.60, do I have modern economic growth? Yes. Yes, I do, because GDP per capita is going up, even if it's a small amount. It's going up, modern economic growth. Something else you need to know is normally our very wealthy leader nations see very slow economic growth because they have to do the trailblazing. It's very difficult for them. They're this ducky right here trying to get up the wall. Like life is tough for them. They have to innovate everything. But when we have these follower nations, these poor nations that have not experienced modern economic growth, when they finally kick it in gear, when things get stable and they start industrializing, then they can see dramatic increases in productivity and they actually catch up a whole lot faster. So their GDP per capita rises faster, their economic growth numbers are always really high, and they try to play catch up very quickly. And the reason for that is they can adopt the most modern methods of producing goods and services. They don't have to jump through all the hoops. They don't have to figure out for the first time that craftsmen are not as good as an assembly line. They don't have to work with steam engines before they can work with gas-powered engines. They just jump to the front of the line. So that's modern economic growth. Follower versus lead nation is going to have at least one question on that. Hope that makes some sense for you. Let's keep rolling. All right, calculating GDP. We have two major approaches here, and really this is just kind of a memorization thing. There's not really a much better way to talk about it than that. I'm going to quickly go through each of the 4 measurements of GDP, or each of the 4 elements of GDP for both the income and expenditure approach. But really, you don't need to know all that much about what each entails. Just have a general idea, and you should be in pretty good shape. And I'll try to emphasize the things you really need to know. So, first one, the expenditure approach. We call it SIG-JICSON, right? The acronym you'll never forget, SIG-JICSON. It's consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports equals real GDP, or just GDP, same thing. So let's pop down and talk about each. Consumption. That's just people like you and me buying goods and services to satisfy our own utility and wants. So consumption is absolutely 100% the largest portion of our GDP. Next up is gross private domestic investment. These are the expenditures by businesses. And they fall into 3 major categories. First is inventory. When businesses are producing more goods than they're selling, their inventory, or the stock room, so to speak, is rising. They have more things that they haven't sold. So they produce things this year, but they don't sell them for next year. We have to account for them this year, though, because they were produced within the borders of our nation within this year. So we count it now when we produce something that we don't sell. So if inventories rise by 12 billion, we're going to see a plus 12 billion right here in our investment portion of GDP. Okay, and if inventories fall, if we sell the goods we produced last year, this year, so inventories are falling, like by $5 billion, then we're going to see a reduction in investment by 5 billion. Okay, next up is capital goods. When businesses are producing goods that make things more productive, when they are purchasing machinery, when they're purchasing factories, when they're purchasing warehouses, or purchasing tools, any of those things are considered capital goods. They make us more productive over time, and so we see an increase in those, and that absolutely becomes an investment purchase when we buy those. And then new construction, anything that's built this year, people are being paid for building it this year, but it's probably not going to be sold until a year later. So new construction, again, is considered an investment in the future. So we count it today for future sales. All right. Probably that's the one that you should focus in a little bit on. I should have a pretty good idea what investment is. I know there's at least one question specifically about investment. Government spending is super simple. When the government spends money, the G on government spending goes up. Net exports. Net exports, a little tricky. This is where they try to trip you up. Instead of just giving you net exports, they give you exports and they give you imports. So simply make sure that you do that additional calculations. Exports minus imports. Exports are good for us. Imports are bad. Exports are injection. Imports are leakage. So that's why we subtract it from there. If the imports are rising, it means our GDP is falling. All other things constant. So keep that in mind. That's a way they can try to be tricky with it. Like, hey, imports are increasing. What's happening in GDP? Like, well, it's increasing. It sounds like a good thing, but actually has an inverse relationship with GDP, because that's leakage. That's money that we're spending, that we earn from here in the United States, that is going over to another nation and going to have a cyclical multiplied impact over there. All right. So that's the expenditure approach. Let's try one out. So jump over here to the right. The green box says calculate GDP given the following information. This is very similar to what you're going to see on the test. Consumption is 400 billion, rents are 50 billion, investments 20 billion, government expenditures 200 billion, costs 30 billion, exports 50 billion, revenues 12 billion, and imports 70 billion. There's a lot more information there than I need. So the first thing you have to figure out is, do I take the expenditure approach or do I take the income approach? Right? So you need to see which of them you have all of the elements for. So I'm looking here and I know I've got consumption, good. I'm just trying out SIG-JICSON. Consumption, do I have investment? Look for it. Yeah, I got investment right there. Awesome. Do I have government expenditures? Boom, got it right there. And then do I have net exports? Well, I have my exports here. Do I have imports? Yes, I do, right here. Everything else is garbage. Everything else is noise. I have my 4 elements. I can calculate GDP. Let me grab my pen over here and we'll do a quick calculation. So I've got 400 for consumption. I'm going to add that to 20 for investment. Ignore the rents. That's an income approach. We don't need that. So I'm at 420. I'm going to add that to my investment, which is 20 billion. I'm sorry, my government expenditures, which is 200 billion. So pop that 200 here. So now I'm at 620. And then I'm going to add that to my net exports, which is exports 50 minus imports 70. 50 minus 70, or instead of this being a plus, it's minus 20. So I pop in here, I got 400, 620 minus 20. My GDP is going to be $600 billion. Okay, hope that makes some sense how I figured that out. Not too bad if you know the equation. That's the important thing there. Next up is the income approach. There's one question where you have to calculate this. You have wages, rents, interest, profits. RIP with a W. WRIP. Right? So wages are simply the money you earn from working. Rents is the money you earn from leasing out whatever you have as a household, your capital goods, for example, and your resources. Interest is the money that banks make when they lend their money to people. Profits is the money that businesses make, and profits are revenue minus costs. Okay, so let's pop over here to question number 2 and see if we can figure this out. So we have, again, way more information than we need. So let's see if we can figure out the income approach. Let's see, we have our wages. Awesome, so I got that. Do I have my rents? Don't need government expenditures. I do need rents, got it right there. Do I have my interest payments? I do, 10 billion right there, awesome. Gross private domestic investment, that's an expenditure thing, don't need that. Revenues, I definitely have those. Minus costs, hey, I can figure out my profits as well. That's all 4 that I need, so let's calculate it. Wages are 100. Rents are 30, so 100 plus 30, so I'm at 130 right now. Interest payments are 10, so I'm at 140 right now. And then revenues are 70, costs are 30. 70 minus 30 is 40, so I'm at $180 billion. That's going to be my GDP. Let's go back. Again, as long as you know the equation, you're going to be in good shape. All right, let's keep rolling. Next up is the business cycle. You won't have to draw this and there won't be an image of it. You just have to know what it is and what it looks like. Okay, so first, know the 4 stages. Know that we always start with an expansion, and then we have a peak, and then we have a recession or contraction, same thing. Then we have a trough, and then we have expansion and we have a peak, and we have a recession and we have a trough. It's expansion, peak, recession, trough. Note that at a peak, our unemployment is at its lowest. We're in full employment, right? And also at that same time, we're probably experiencing inflation. And then know that at a trough, our unemployment is the highest and our price level is stagnant. Inflation is probably pretty stable at that point, not going up from year to year. Okay, so that's very important. And then cyclical impact. A cyclical impact, know what's impacted the most when we have a recession. So durable goods are by far the most directly impacted, mainly because they normally cost a whole lot more money and because they're goods and services you don't necessarily need to live day to day. They're things that can be put off. Houses are a great example of a durable good that's put off. Cars oftentimes are put off during this time. Major expenses, college education, weddings, things like that are more likely to be put off because there's such huge expenses, for sure. Non-durable goods, very recession resistant. Non-durable goods last a lot, or oftentimes are not heavily affected, mainly because this includes major categories that we need every day, like fuel for our car. Doesn't matter if we're in a recession, I still need to get to work or need to be able to get to an interview if I don't have work. Non-durable goods like food, I still have to eat, right? So that's very recession resistant. But even if we're in a recession, things are fine. And then services. Services are kind of middle of the road. Some services that are more luxurious, like going on a vacation, oftentimes have heavy cyclical impact. And services that are not very luxurious, but are definitely necessary, like a visit to the hospital, for example, are unlikely to have much of an impact or be heavily impacted by the business cycle. So just know the difference between those and why durable goods are impacted the most initially. Okay, we're rolling. Next up, unemployment. Unemployment has a lot to it, so I'm going to try to go through it quickly so we can get to our examples. So first, we start with the labor force. Remember, you're going to be given a population, and that population isn't enough. I need to know who is actually a part of the labor force and who is not before I can calculate unemployment, right? Because not everybody all the time is working. Some people intentionally don't work. Think of stay-at-home moms and dads, for example. So we have to calculate that. First, who is not counted? So we know people who are not of age are not counted. For example, people under 16. We know that anybody that's institutionalized, they're not free. So if you're not free, you can't be a part of the labor force. And then we have the demoralized unemployed, people who are not able to work because they just are down and out. They feel like, why even try? And then, of course, anybody that's experiencing a disability or something like that that prevents them from working would also fall into this category. Okay. Also, there are a couple other ways to find your labor force. You can find it by simply multiplying your population times your labor force participation rate. So if my population is 100 and my labor force participation rate is 50%, I take 50% of 100, my labor force is 50. The other way I can figure out my labor force is simply it's made up of my unemployed and my employed. So if I'm giving how many people are unemployed, I'm also given how many people are employed, and I know my labor force, right? So let me grab the pen here. So if if I have 50 people that are unemployed and I have 150 people that are employed, then I know my labor force is going to be 200 because my labor force is made up of everybody who's working and everybody who wants to work but isn't currently working. Okay. Let's keep rolling. How do you calculate unemployment? Once you have the labor force, very important, you have to get that first. Once you have that, it's actually not that bad. You simply take your number of unemployed workers, divide it by your labor force, and then make it into a percentage, and that'll kick out your unemployment rate. So let's jump over here and to our example number 1 and see if we can solve this. Get my pen here. Going to change the color to purple. All right, so calculate the unemployment rate given the following information. I have 120 million in my population. I have 70 million that are employed. I have 20 million that are unemployed. So I'm not given my labor force, but I have to find it. So how do I find my labor force? Well, remember, we have these two ways. I can multiply it if I'm given the participation rate, I can figure it out that way. Or if I have my unemployed and my employed, I can find it that way. Well, I just happen to have my employed and unemployed. My employed are 70 million. My unemployed, 20 million. Notice my population is just a decoy. I don't need that at all, right? So my 70 plus 20 is going to kick out a labor force of 90 million. So I'm just going to put a 90 here. And then I jump into my calculating unemployment. Simply my unemployed divided by my labor force. Unemployed is 20 million. Labor force is 90. If I say 20 divided by 90, let's see what we got here. 20 divided by 90. And that gives me 22.2%. 22.2%. Boom. That is my unemployment rate. Okay, not that bad. Unemployed divided by labor force, but make sure you find labor force first. And you should be in the free and clear. All right, next up, really important, knowing the types of unemployment. We see this all the time on the AP exam. They love these questions for some reason. So we have 3 types. We have frictional. Frictional unemployment is when you are between jobs because you've chosen to be between jobs. Normally, this means that you are leaving one job for a better one, or you are leaving college for a better job. And we actually consider this lag time between when you are available for a job and when you get a job. Consider that a good thing. This is positive unemployment because it means our workers are bettering themselves, investing in their human capital. We like frictional unemployment. But with our current modernification, it's a tough word, modernification, that frictional unemployment is getting less and less because it's becoming easier and easier to find workers and to find work with the advent of online, like monster.com, for example, to find jobs. Okay, second is structural unemployment. Structural unemployment means the structure of our economy has changed. So as a result, these workers are obsolete. And so in order to enter the workforce again, they have to get retrained. So that's always a key indicator. If they have to get more training, go back to school, they're considered cyclically unemployed. Okay, and that's considered a good thing as well. When our economy changed from manufacturing to a service industry, We had a whole bunch of factory workers that were cyclically unemployed. They had to get retrained and re-enter the labor force. But our service industry resulted in a massive increase in GDP for several years. And most people would say our economy is much better for it, even though it was very painful for individuals that were experiencing it. That's structural unemployment. And finally, cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment refers to the business cycle. It means that people are losing their jobs simply because people are afraid. Businesses are worried about profitability, and so they lay people off. When people are laid off, they worry about spending money, and so demand falls. When demand falls, businesses lose profits. They worry, they lay people off, repeat the process. So our economy is just broken in a recession. People are not spending money. And so you simply don't have a job because our economy is inefficient. And so this is the critical part. This is the part that we can fix. This is the part we don't like. This is a point inside of the production possibilities curve, right? And we want to get it back onto the production possibilities curve. Important to note that frictional plus structural unemployment is actually considered full employment, or the natural rate of unemployment, right? So when we are fully employed, it doesn't mean our unemployment rate is zero. It means our unemployment rate is frictional plus structural. Frictional plus structural. Okay, so let's pop over here to calculate our full employment for our example number 2. Let me get my little marker here. So it says calculate full employment, or the natural rate of unemployment, and frictional unemployment given the following information. So I'm given the unemployment rate is 17%. Hold that, total unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is 5. Structural unemployment is 3. What's my full unemployment? Well, I can't figure that out until I find structural. Remember over here, structural and frictional. I'm only given cyclical. But I do know that all 3 of these make up unemployment. So cyclical, 5, plus structural, 3, plus the one that's missing, which is frictional, I'm just going to put an F there, equals 17. So 8 plus F equals 17, or in other words, my frictional unemployment is going to be 9%. My frictional unemployment is 9. My structural unemployment is 3. Then my natural rate of unemployment, or NRU, full employment, is going to be frictional plus structural, so 9 plus 3, or 12%. Hopefully that made some sense how I did that. Remember just that idea that these 3 unemployments make up the unemployment rate altogether, and then just frictional and structural are considered a full employment, or a natural rate of unemployment. Okay. Finally, a couple of critiques. There's a question about this. The main critique of unemployment as a metric is part-time workers, right? They're not counted. If you work 1 hour, it's the same as working 40 hours in our metric per week. So part-time workers are counted as fully employed. And so that underestimates our unemployment rate. Unemployment rate probably should be higher. We counted for underemployed people, as we call them. And then demoralized people are not counted as the labor force. So again, our unemployment rate looks better than it actually would be if people who just stopped looking for jobs because they didn't care anymore, because they were so depressed about the job market, we counted them in the labor force, they would be unemployed. And so that unemployment rate would be much higher. Okay, so keep that in mind, that critique. There's one question on that. All right, our final slide, inflation. So the first thing you need to know about inflation is the rising of all prices. We calculate the rising of all prices by using the market basket, just 300 goods that represent what people spend their money on in a given year. So we take our current market basket value, we divide it by our base year market value, we multiply by 100, and that kicks out our CPI, our Consumer Price Index, or a number that we can use to see the changes of overall general prices from year to year. Okay, so let's try this out. Over here, question number 1, we have a market basket of 3,500 in the current year, and then our base year market basket is 2,100. What's our CPI? So let's grab our marker here. I got this equation. I know this equation, so I've got 3,500. And I simply divide it by my base year. That's what we do for all of these. Whenever we're talking market baskets, you don't have to do current minus previous. It's only for change over time. I'm looking at this year's prices and compared to first year prices. So I just divide it by my base year. So 2,500 divided by 2,100 will kick out a number for me. See what it is. 3,500 divided by 2,100 equals 1.66. 1.66. And then I multiply that 1.66 by 100 to get a nice solid number. My CPI is going to be 166. That's how you count. Current divided by previous, or base year, sorry. Current divided by base year will always kick out your CPI. So keep that in mind, know that equation. You're going to have to use that equation 5 or 6 times on this exam, so I'd really make sure I have that one under my belt. All right. Calculating inflation then, if I have CPIs, current and previous CPI, then I can plug it into my growth equation, which is simply current minus previous divided by previous, over and over and over again, right? So that's all we got to do to find the inflation rate. And then you multiply by 100 to get into a percentage. So let's try this out. My blue going here. So let's calculate the inflation rate if current year CPI is 120 and previous year CPI is 110. Okay, that's all I need to do right now. So let's try that out. So I have a current of 120. I know it's current minus previous. So 120 minus previous year was 110. Dun, da, da, da. That's going to kick out 10. I divide that by my previous, right? 110. So current minus previous divided by previous, or 10 divided by 110. You might be able to do that in your head, but I can't. 10 divided by 110 gives me 0.090. And I multiply that by 100, move that decimal over twice, my inflation rate is 9%. 9%. Okay? Now, the next one asks me a question that is actually going to get into different types of inflation. We have cost push inflation. We have demand pull inflation. Cost push is caused by increased prices on resources used to produce goods. So like labor costs go up. Businesses are like, man, this costs more. I should probably charge more. So prices rise as a result of that. And then demand pull is just people like us going out and buying more stuff. Our demand goes up and it pushes general prices up. So how do we tell the difference? Well, in a cost push inflation scenario, GDP is falling. And if GDP is rising, it's demand pull. Cost push is causing a recession at the same time, because when businesses' costs go up, they immediately reduce production. When you reduce production, you lay people off and you fall into a recession. Okay, so the next one says current GDP is 120. Previous year was 130. So what happened to GDP? It went from 130 to 120. It went down. GDP is falling. So we're in a recession. We have an inflation rate of 9%. And we're in a recession because GDP went down by $10 billion. So what type of inflation is occurring? Cost push. Cost push inflation is occurring as a result. Right? Okay, hopefully that made some sense. Who is helped and hurt by inflation? And so the final thing, you really don't need to know a lot about this, but you do need to know a little about it. Now, I'll try to emphasize what. The people that are hurt by inflation are the fixed income people. People whose incomes stay the same year after year after year. So these are pensioners. Also lenders. When I lend money out, the money I lend is actually more valuable than the money I get back when inflation happens. And then savers. When you put money in the bank and inflation is occurring, it eats up the value of the dollars as they sit there in the bank. Okay, so savers are hurt by this as well. Who's helped? The people who are helped are absolutely those flexible income earners, right? If you have a cost of living adjustment or wage increases, you are helped by this. But also the borrowers are helped. The borrowers, when they borrow the money, it's worth more than the money that they pay back. Okay, so keep that in mind. Know who is helped by this. Definitely also helped. Sorry, I should put this on here. Let me pop it on here. Also helped are businesses. Businesses do very, very well. They're part of that flex income because they charge higher prices on the front end. Okay, so keep that in mind, particularly that businesses and borrowers are helped in these scenarios. Now, that's unanticipated inflation, but we do try to predict these things. We look into the future and try to project. And if we accurately project it, we can actually mitigate or get rid of the negative effects of it, right? So as long as wages and price level or inflation are going up at the same rate, then we really don't have any problem. Sure, we're paying more, but we're also making more. So our quality of life is actually staying pretty steady. Oh, households, if they predict that the inflation rate is going to go higher in the future, then they demand higher wages. They demand cost of living adjustments. They go into their boss and say, "Look, I'm doing the same work I was doing before, and I'm being paid less because my real income is actually falling." And then banks, and this is the important one. Banks actually, when they expect inflation, they just build it into their inflation rate. So they have a real interest rate, which is a rate that the money is actually worth. Then they have a nominal interest rate, which is a rate that they actually charge you as the borrower, right? And the difference between those two is inflation. So real interest rate plus inflation is nominal. So I'm going to charge you the real interest rate, which is where I make money as a bank. But I'm also going to charge you for inflation. I'm going to make sure that you take care of inflation, not me, the bank, because I don't want to be hurt by this. Remember, lenders are hurt. So I don't want to be hurt by this. You're the one that needs it. You should be paying the cost for it. That's the idea. So real interest rate plus inflation equals nominal interest rate. And this actually goes for anything between nominal and real. If there's a percent change in nominal GDP and a percent change in real GDP, the difference between those percentage changes is inflation rate. So inflation plus real always equals nominal when I'm dealing with rates and percentages. Anyways, you don't need to know that right now. So let's jump over to number 3. The expected inflation rate is 4%. The real interest rate is 3%. What interest will banks likely charge? So I know inflation is going to be 4% in the future, or at least I'm predicting it. So I am going to build that in. My real interest rate is what I would normally charge them if there's no inflation. That's how I make money. So it's 3%. I add my inflation rate. So I'm going to make sure that that rate is going to be held by the consumers as well. So that's 4%. So what is the rate I'm actually going to charge? I'm going to charge a premium rate of 7%, which will give me my profits and offset any negative effects of inflation. Whew, that's it. That's this entire unit. It's a lot of content, but know those few equations that are really important and hone in on the things we're talking about today. These example questions are pretty similar to things you might see on the actual test, and I hope this has been helpful for you. If you have any questions, let me know, and remember we have review sessions 5A and 5B on Friday. All right, see you later.